Ah, come and let me tell you a tale these eyes have seen. A story from the annals of destiny. She was one of the greatest of all time. Ah, she ever did shine. She climbed so high above the clouds in the sky. To all she would seem to gravity defy. But alas, as Sir Isaac said, what must go up must come down. And she did come tumbling to the ground. And this is her story of that magnificent fall. So we're going to be talking about the fall of the Roman Republic today. The Roman Republic was an amazing time in the Roman civilization. It's probably the greatest republic in all times. People would argue, oh, America's the greatest republic. We ain't been around near as long, nor, you know, so let's see, and as time tells, a couple of hundred years from now, where we are compared to Rome. But as of so far, and from my opinion, Rome is the greatest republic so far. And so, but this republic began to have problems in its latter years. And we're looking, the republic's been around for 400 years or so at this point. That these problems started developing earlier, but it's been around, before the real downfall of the republic starts to really pick up steam. And we're going to kick back a little further, and then you'll start to see as the problems build upon each other, which leads to the fall of the republic. And to get off of that is the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. That's something that tends to happen. In 100 BC, farmers were in debt uh, because of fighting wars. They didn't have professional soldiers, so whenever there was a war, they would have the peasants, the plebeians, come forth and enlist in the armies and go and fight. And it was up to the general to pay you some. Well, these farmers were constantly having to go fight because Rome was constantly expanding. And, well, these farmers were out fighting and stuff, and so they couldn't farm and make enough to pay for their farms. So the wealthy Romans came up and started buying up the farms. And rather than letting the farmers farm them, they would bring in slave labor and have the slaves farm it, and they would make more money off of it. And they would become wealthier, and those who were already poor would become poor. And the politicians supported this, and they were able to get the people to support them because these poor people, they would provide them food and entertainment, bread and circus. Uh, and they would entertain them so they would be happy and feed them so they would be full. And they would vote for these politicians who would then continue to further this process of making the rich richer and the poor poorer. A voice of justice came out, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, and they were two very wealthy brothers. They asked that the Senate take the land and give it back to the poor farmers. But you have to remember, a large group of these senators were some of these people who were involved in it, and they were making money off of this. Well, in 133 BC, a group of senators killed Tiberius. And then a few years later, in 121 BC, they killed Gaius. Okay, because they didn't like them speaking out against them and the way they were becoming wealthy. A road to change. So a change is a coming. In 107 BC, Marius, he was a military leader, became the new consul. Remember when we talked about consuls are elected every year? There's two of them. And he began recruiting soldiers from the poor. And he changed the army from volunteers to professionals. Because as I mentioned, they would volunteer and they would earn money from, their general, whoever was leading them. Um, and because their loyalty had always been to that general who was paying them and not to the republic itself. Well, in 82 BC, a guy by the name of Sulla came along and made himself dictator. He had a strong enough following. And what he did was he weakened the assembly and strengthened the Senate. He saw the glory of Rome fading, and this during this time period, this last 100 years of the Republic, um, people began seeing the downfall of the Republic, and they didn't like that, and they wanted to do what they could in order to reestablish what they called the glory of the Republic. And so he strengthened the Senate, hoping that this would give power back to the Republic. And in 79 BC, Sulla steps down, so he's only made himself dictator for a couple of years. And he was hoping that Rome would recapture this glory. But instead, he furthered the decline of the Republic, because what he started was people began to see, oh well, we can snatch power, and people tend to get power hungry if they think they have a shot of becoming more powerful. And so over the next 50 years was a period of civil war. You had in 73 BC, Spartacus and 78 other gladiators led a rebellion, and he was a former slave. And there's a lot of stuff about Spartacus now, and he was sent out, sold in, well, put into slavery and into gladiators, and he worked his way up and then led a rebellion. There's a great old movie called Spartacus with Michael Douglas and Kirk Douglas, Michael Douglas's father. Um, that goes over some of that, but and he had several victories against minor Roman armies and militia. And the slave army grew. Like they would free slaves, and the slaves would join them. And this army grew to about 120,000. I know I'm missing a zero there. 71 BC, the slave army was defeated by Crassus. And Crassus becomes a fairly big name. He's a upper well-to-do person in general in the Roman society. Um, 6,000 slaves were taken as prisoner, and they were crucified because, we hear crucifixion with Jesus. Well, crucifying was the Roman form of execution. Like in the United States, we tend to use the electric chair, the gas chamber, or something. Well, they used the crucifix. And the Appian Way was the road that came into Rome. And they were crucified along this as a warning to, hey, you better not rebel or this is going to happen to you. The first triumvirate. A triumvirate is a political alliance of three. In 60 BC, that dude by the name of Crassus, he was a pretty big shot. He was a military leader and he was the richest man in Rome. And then two other guys, Pompey and Julius Caesar. They were both wealthy and great generals. And these three formed the first triumvirate of Rome. And they held significant power and pretty much kind of decided for a period what would happen in the Roman Republic. And so from here on out, it really gets a lot more in depth of, backstabbing and fighting for control and, who has the most power and people afraid that somebody else is going to take their power. And so it really starts to pick up at this point. And these three kind of ruled the roost for a little while. But tune in next time, and we're going to talk more specifically about one of these guys, and it's the one that we all know, Julius Caesar. Um, we're going to talk about how he rose up in power and became part of the triumvirate, and what happened to him after the triumvirate and uh, throughout the rest of his life to become one of the great men of history. Uh, so tune in next time, and we'll continue this sad tale of the fall of the Roman Republic. Ah, wasn't she beautiful? Until next time, deuces!